The summer of 1862 was supposed to be another season of hard work and quiet harvest in Minnesota. Families along the frontier had settled into their routines, building farms, raising children, and carving a life from the edge of wilderness. But that year, a shadow spread across the prairie, a shadow born of hunger, betrayal, and conflict that would erupt into one of the bloodiest chapters in American frontier history, the Dakota War. Among the many names and numbers lost in its wake, there is one story that lingers like a ghost in the tall grass, the story of a family that seemed to vanish without a trace during the massacre. It begins with the image of an isolated homestead, a modest log house standing against the wide sky, the smell of cut hay drifting on the wind. Inside lived a family who, like so many others, had believed in the promise of land and prosperity. They had come westward with hopes of peace, unaware that the very soil beneath their feet carried tensions centuries deep. To their neighbors, they were ordinary, hardworking, unremarkable, another thread in the fragile fabric of the frontier. But when the uprising began, that fabric tore violently, and their names slipped into silence. Witnesses later spoke of screams carried on the prairie wind, of smoke rising from cabins, of riders appearing like shadows at the edge of farms. The family's home was one of many consumed by this chaos. No survivors were ever found within its walls. No clear bodies were recovered. Only fragments, charred wood, blood in the dirt, and whispers among neighbors remained to suggest their fate. Some believed they had been taken captive, their lives swallowed into the brutal reality of war. Others insisted they had been killed instantly, their remains scattered beyond recognition. And still others swore the land itself had swallowed them whole, as if the prairie had claimed back what it once owned. To tell their story is not to exploit their pain, but to understand how history itself can erase people, leaving behind only shadows. Theirs is not a tale of individuals alone, but a mirror of the larger storm consuming Minnesota in 1862. This was not a random disappearance, but part of a vast tragedy where hundreds of settlers and Dakota alike lost their lives in a conflict fueled by starvation, broken treaties, and desperation. Yet because their family left behind no survivors, their story remains suspended an echo in the silence of a farmstead that no longer stands. The mystery of their vanishing is more than a matter of crime or accident. It is the collision of cultures, the clash of survival against survival. To walk back into their story is to walk into the twilight of the frontier, where safety was an illusion, and where the line between life and disappearance could vanish overnight. Even now, more than a century later, their absence lingers, asking questions no historian can fully answer. Were they buried secretly in unmarked ground? Did they suffer in captivity, their names erased from memory? Or were they lost in such violence that no trace could ever be found? Tonight we return to 1862, to the prairies of Minnesota, to the lonely house that once stood on contested soil, and to the family who vanished in the massacre, their story a haunting reminder that history does not only remember those who lived, it remembers, in its own way, those who simply disappeared. To understand how an entire family could vanish into silence during the summer of 1862, we must first step back into the world they inhabited. Minnesota, at the time, was a relatively new state, admitted to the Union in 1858. Just 4 years later, it stood on the edge of chaos. The land was fertile, rich with rivers and prairies, and settlers from the eastern United States and Europe rushed to claim it. For them, Minnesota was a promise, a frontier where a man's work could yield a farm, where families could take root, where the dream of ownership and permanence could finally be realized. Yet beneath this vision lay another reality. The Dakota Sioux had lived on these lands for generations, hunting, farming, and moving with the rhythm of the seasons. Their lives were tied to the rivers, the buffalo, and the soil itself. To them, the newcomers were intruders, steadily pushing them into smaller and smaller reserves. The treaties signed between the Dakota and the United States government were often broken or manipulated. Promised annuities were delayed or withheld, supplies were spoiled, and food shipments never arrived. By the summer of 1862, hunger had spread through Dakota communities. Crops had failed, game had grown scarce, and their families were starving. When desperate Dakota men asked for food at trading posts, they were met with disdain and cruelty. One trader's infamous remark that the Dakota could eat grass if they were hungry echoed as a spark that would ignite a war. Settlers, meanwhile, carried their own fears. They had built homes far from towns, separated by miles of prairie, with only the thin protection of local militias. Rumors of raids had circulated for years, and tensions often erupted into skirmishes along the frontier. Yet many families still believed in the dream of permanence. They planted fields of wheat, raised cattle, and built barns, believing the federal government would protect them. The illusion of safety was strong, and the silence of the prairie often lulled them into thinking the conflict was far away. But in truth, they lived on contested groundland, claimed, promised, and stolen, now vibrating with desperation on both sides. Cultural misunderstandings widened the divide. For the Dakota, survival meant mobility, community, and balance with nature. For settlers, it meant ownership, boundaries, and expansion. Each side saw the other through a lens of suspicion. The settlers spoke of savage attacks, while the Dakota saw broken promises and an invasion of their homeland. By 1862, both groups were locked in a relationship of mistrust. And then came the spark. On August 17th, 4 young Dakota men killed 5 settlers near Acton Township after a confrontation over food and eggs. The killings lit the fire. Within days, Dakota warriors organized, and villages across the frontier were attacked. Cabins burned, fields were abandoned, and families fled toward the safety of forts and towns. The family who vanished lived in this crucible of tension. Their farm was not far from the Minnesota River Valley, where the violence burned hottest. To neighbors, they were quiet people, raising children, tending livestock, trying to carve out stability. They had heard the rumors, perhaps even glimpsed Dakota families passing along the edge of their land. But like many, they hoped neutrality could be protection. On the frontier, survival often meant coexistence, however fragile. But when the war came, neutrality meant nothing. The prairie became a battlefield, and their home became a target. The scale of the uprising was vast. In just 6 weeks, hundreds of settlers were killed and thousands fled eastward. Entire counties emptied as families crowded into makeshift forts, schools, and churches seeking refuge. The U.S. military responded with force, sending regiments to crush the Dakota resistance. Villages were destroyed, warriors were hunted, and captives were taken on both sides. The aftermath would lead to the largest mass execution in American history. 38 Dakota men hanged in Mankato on December 26, 1862, watched by a crowd of thousands. The conflict was not just a war, it was an unraveling of communities, a rupture of trust, and a transformation of Minnesota's cultural landscape forever. Within this storm, the disappearance of one family did not stand out immediately. So many were dead, so many homes destroyed, so many missing. Yet their story, retold in hushed tones, carried an extra weight. Unlike others whose bodies were eventually found or whose names appeared on casualty lists, theirs were never clearly accounted for. Neighbors spoke of smoke rising from their homestead, of blood on the grass, of belongings scattered. Some swore they saw tracks leading away from the farm, suggesting capture. Others insisted the family had been slaughtered and buried in haste, their remains lost to the soil. Still others believed they might have escaped in the chaos, only to vanish somewhere along the road to safety. Their fate became an unsolved thread woven into the broader tapestry of the war. To understand this mystery, we must also recognize the silence that followed. For survivors, speaking of the vanished often meant reopening wounds too raw to bear. For officials, the sheer scale of the conflict made individual cases disappear into numbers. And for the Dakota, oral tradition carried stories of the war, but not always of specific settler families. Thus, the vanishing family slipped into obscurity, their existence remembered only through fragments of memory, a name in an old newspaper, a rumor passed down by descendants of neighbors. They became part of the ghostly ledger of the frontier, where lives could be erased overnight by violence, and history would only mark them as a whisper. In the larger context, the Massacre of 1862 was not a single event, but a series of eruptions born from systemic injustice. The disappearance of the family is not just a mystery, it is a symbol of the fragility of human lives caught between two worlds in collision. It is a reminder that behind every statistic of war lies a household, a story, a set of dreams interrupted. Their absence is a shadow that points back to the deeper story of Minnesota in 1862, a place where treaties were broken, where starvation became a weapon, where settlers sought safety and Dakota sought survival, and where the prairie itself seemed to open and consume those who dared to live upon it. That is the stage on which the family's vanishing must be understood, a world of hunger and mistrust, a frontier where lines between right and wrong blurred into survival, and a moment in history where silence itself became one of the deadliest weapons. The summer of 1862 in Minnesota carried with it a strange stillness, one that seemed to deepen in the weeks leading to the uprising. The family at the center of this mystery had settled in a modest cabin not far from the Minnesota River Valley. Their days followed a simple rhythm: tending crops, caring for livestock, and teaching their children letters by candlelight when dusk fell. Yet there was an unease hanging over the prairie. Neighbors whispered about Dakota men spotted near the fields, watching silently from the tree line. Horses grew restless at night, as though they sensed something that the settlers tried to ignore. The family lived with these signs, caught between the hope of ordinary life and the dread of the unknown. The first real incident came in mid-August. Just after word spread of violence at Acton, settlers traveling on horseback shouted warnings across farms: cabins burned, families killed, danger spreading. The family heard those cries but hesitated. The husband believed it safer to stay hidden at home than to risk the open road. They locked their doors, drew their shutters, and tried to silence the cries of their children when fear crept in. It was then, neighbors later said, that strange noises came from the edge of the property. Horses stamping, dogs barking, shadows moving in the tall grass. Some swore they saw figures crouched in the wheat fields, waiting. But when the morning came, nothing seemed disturbed save for the feeling that they were being watched. Days later, a neighbor passing by claimed to have seen the father stumble in the yard, as though struck from behind. The neighbor shouted, but the man rose quickly, waving it off, pretending it was nothing more than fatigue. Yet, as the story spread, others began to wonder, had it been the butt of a rifle or a thrown stone? Small signs of violence seemed to creep toward the household, testing the boundaries before the storm arrived. The wife was said to have cut her hand while splitting kindling, the blood pooling in the dirt beside the chopping block. It was an accident, perhaps, but in memory it became one more omen, a foreshadowing of the blood that would soon follow. By the third week of August, the prairie was alive with terror. Cabins were found with doors broken, the walls marked by the strike of axes. Survivors told of warriors entering with blades drawn, their cries filling the night. Others recounted families dragged from their homes, some killed swiftly, others captured and marched into the woods. Rumors told of settlers attempting to flee, only to collapse on the roadsides, arrows buried deep in their backs. Amid this chaos, the family's fate began to unravel. A traveler passing near their farm reported smoke curling above the trees, but when he approached, the cabin still stood. And yet, something was wrong. A chair overturned on the porch, the door hanging crooked, the yard silent. Chickens scattered as if startled, but no voices answered his calls. The incidents became darker, more violent in memory. One settler swore he found the family's axe buried in a fence post, its blade still slick. Another claimed he had seen a child's doll torn and muddy near the creek, its porcelain face cracked. The stories shifted with each telling. Some spoke of footprints leading into the woods, others of blood on the steps. There were whispers of a struggle inside the house, a table overturned, crockery shattered, quilts pulled from the bed as though someone had been dragged across it. The details were never recorded officially, but passed down through frightened retellings, each one adding a layer of dread to the tale. In one account, the mother was said to have been seen running into the fields, clutching something in her arms, perhaps a child, perhaps nothing but a bundle of cloth. She stumbled, fell, and rose again, before vanishing into the tall grass. Another version claimed that neighbors heard screams in the night, high-pitched and fleeting, cut off as though swallowed by the wind. No one dared to approach until morning, and by then, silence ruled the homestead. No smoke rose from the chimney. No animals stirred in the barn. Only the wind moved, carrying with it the smell of scorched wood and iron. The investigators who came weeks later found little to confirm the rumors. The cabin had been ransacked, yes, but by then so many cabins had suffered the same fate it was impossible to say when the damage had occurred. The fields lay trampled, the crops ruined, the fences torn down. In the well, someone claimed to have seen scraps of cloth floating, though when examined, nothing remained but water and silt. It was as though the land itself had conspired to erase their presence. Some believed the family had been captured, marched westward into Dakota camps, their fate sealed in silence. Others thought they had been slaughtered in the house, their remains burned or buried in haste, the evidence lost in the frenzy of war. Still others insisted they had fled east, blending with other refugees, leaving their farm to become just another ghost of the frontier. The most chilling detail came from a neighbor who swore he saw markings carved into the cabin door, strange symbols, crosses, or perhaps nothing more than the desperate scratches of a knife. He claimed the cuts dripped with resin, dark as blood, and that when he touched them, the wood seemed warm, as though it had absorbed the violence that occurred there. Whether this was truth or embellishment, it lingered in memory, a haunting image of a house that had witnessed something unspeakable. What makes the disappearance of this family so unsettling is the absence of closure. For most, the uprising left behind bodies to bury, graves to mark, survivors to weep. For them, there was only absence. Their names appeared briefly in newspapers listed as missing, presumed dead, but no record followed. They became a blank space in the ledger of history, their lives reduced to whispers in taverns and in the margins of diaries. The prairie that had once held their laughter now held only silence. And in that silence, stories grew darker, more elaborate, more terrifying. As the years passed, descendants of neighbors claimed to see strange lights near the old homestead site, or to hear cries carried by the wind on summer nights. Hunters said their dogs refused to enter the ruins, tails tucked, growling low at nothing visible. Farmers plowing the land claimed their blades struck hard objects beneath the soil stones, they said, though sometimes they swore it sounded like bone. And so the insidious chain of incidents stretched beyond the war itself, lingering into memory, into legend, into the haunted folklore of Minnesota's darkest summer. The family's vanishing was not a single event, but a sequence of disturbances, each one more dreadful than the last. The father struck, the mother bleeding, the doll shattered, the screams swallowed, the cabin overturned, the symbols carved. It was as if history itself had conspired to erase them piece by piece, leaving behind only fragments of terror, enough to ensure their absence would never truly be forgotten. In the silence of their disappearance, the massacre found its most haunting expression not in the bodies counted, but in the family that left no trace at all. When news of the disappearance reached neighboring farms, the reaction was immediate and visceral. The prairie was already tense, with families barricading their doors, churches crowded with those seeking comfort, and the sound of distant gunfire echoing across the valley. The loss of an entire family, without a single trace, struck a nerve deeper than even the confirmed killings. Bodies could be buried, names could be read at funerals, and graves could be marked with wooden crosses. But here there was nothing. The absence gnawed at those who survived, filling the community with a terror that could not be soothed. Neighbors were the first to gather near the empty cabin. Some entered cautiously, rifles in hand, while others refused to step across the threshold at all. They found no bodies, only disorder, the table overturned, the hearth cold, the bedding ripped apart. Women wept openly at the sight, covering their mouths with kerchiefs, while men shook their heads in silence. One man muttered that it was worse than seeing corpses because without the evidence of death, one could not be sure where the souls had gone. In the silence of that ruined home, whispers grew that the land itself was cursed, that no family should dare to settle there again. Clergy played a critical role in shaping the early response. Pastors used the family's disappearance as a warning from the pulpit. They spoke of sin, of divine punishment, of the dangers of pride that led settlers to push deeper into the frontier. Congregants sat stiffly in the pews listening to the sermon, their minds already haunted by the image of the vanished family. For some, the message brought a strange comfort, the idea that God had a reason, that suffering followed a pattern, that no terror occurred without purpose. For others, it only deepened their despair, suggesting that no human effort could have saved them. The press, too, seized upon the mystery. Newspapers printed bold headlines: a family lost to the uprising, settlers vanished without a trace, massacre or abduction. The stories were riddled with speculation. Some papers claimed the family had been taken captive, marched west to suffer in silence. Others suggested a swift slaughter, their remains hidden in shallow graves. A few dared to print stranger theories that the family had fled of their own will, abandoning neighbors in their moment of need, or that supernatural forces had claimed them. The lack of concrete evidence allowed journalists to spin narratives that blurred fact and imagination, fanning the flames of fear across Minnesota and beyond. Families who had known them personally reacted in deeply human ways. Some relatives clung to the hope of survival, insisting that the missing had escaped and would return when the violence subsided. They kept lamps burning in their windows, meals set aside in case of a sudden homecoming. Others, more pragmatic, accepted that the family was gone. They gathered at the site to pray, to weep, and to leave tokens of remembrance, flowers laid in the dirt, scraps of cloth tied to fence posts, hymns sung in trembling voices. In the act of memorializing what could not be proven, they gave form to their grief. Doctors and men of science approached the matter with a colder lens. Some suggested that in the chaos of the uprising, records had simply been lost, that the family's deaths were no different from hundreds of others, only obscured by confusion. A few even dismissed the mystery altogether, arguing that the tales of vanishing were the result of hysteria, exaggerated by rumor and fear. Yet even these rational voices could not dispel the unsettling details: the blood on the steps, the overturned chairs, the doll found broken near the creek. These fragments resisted neat explanation, leaving a void that medicine and logic could not easily fill. Psychological interpretations began to surface as well. Observers noted how trauma warped memory. Survivors of the uprising frequently misremembered details, blending nightmares with reality. Perhaps, some said, the disappearance of the family was less a literal vanishing and more a collapse of memory, an inability of neighbors to face the brutality of what had occurred. In this view, the vanished family became a collective projection, a way to make sense of grief too vast to articulate. If the family had no bodies, then perhaps they lived still, somewhere out of sight, in a place beyond human reach. This fragile hope kept the horror at bay, even if it was built on sand. In taverns and trading posts, the story became a kind of folklore almost immediately. Men spoke of the cabin in low voices, warning newcomers never to walk near it after dark. Some claimed to have seen lights flickering in the windows, though the house had been abandoned for months. Others told of hearing the laughter of children carried on the night wind. The tale grew in each telling, passed down like a ghost story, each detail exaggerated to keep listeners captive. By winter, the missing family was no longer just settlers lost in war. They had become figures of legend, symbols of the prairie's mercilessness. Not everyone reacted with fear. Some settlers, hardened by war, dismissed the story as foolishness. They argued that energy should be spent on rebuilding homes, tending crops, and securing defenses, not on chasing shadows of the vanished. Yet even these men, when pressed, admitted to unease. More than one confessed to avoiding the path that led past the abandoned homestead, preferring to take the long way around. Courage faltered in the presence of absence, and the silence of the prairie proved heavier than any argument. Years later, descendants of those who lived nearby still spoke of the vanished family. The tale endured not because of confirmed facts, but because of the void at its center. Graves could be marked, tragedies catalogued, wars remembered, but a disappearance lingered, refusing to be pinned down, haunting the imagination across generations. The missing family became a wound in the collective memory of Minnesota, a reminder that not all horrors could be contained by words, stone markers, or sermons. Their absence became their presence, a ghost etched into the landscape itself. In the end, the reaction of society reflected the fractures of a frontier under siege. Faith tried to explain it. The press sensationalized it. Science tried to dismiss it, and ordinary people wove it into folklore. None of these responses brought clarity. Instead, they revealed how humans cling to stories, no matter how fragile, when faced with the incomprehensible. The family's disappearance was not simply a loss, it was a mirror, reflecting the fear, guilt, and desperation of a community standing at the edge of survival. The prairie was never silent again, not truly. Even in the years after the uprising, when the fields had been replanted and cabins rebuilt, those who passed near the vanished family's homestead spoke of an atmosphere so heavy it seemed to crush the chest. But for those who lived through the autumn of 1862, the climax came on one unforgettable night when memory, rumor, and fear collided in a way that blurred the boundary between history and haunting. It began with the sound of dogs barking. Neighbors who had returned to salvage tools and livestock from their abandoned homes reported that the animals, usually calm, erupted in frantic howls near the family's cabin. The barking carried across the fields, joined by the frightened whinnies of horses. Men gathered rifles, women clutched their children, and together they marched toward the cabin, torches casting long shadows over the frost-hardened ground. What they found inside was worse than any had imagined. The rooms already known to be in disarray now appeared disturbed once more, as if someone had entered since the last search. Chairs were upright where once they had been overturned, and new footprints marked the dust on the floorboards. A cracked lantern lay on the hearth, its glass shattered, its oil spilled and blackened as though it had been lit not long before. The neighbors looked at one another with wide eyes. Who had been here? And why had they chosen this place, where the memory of disappearance lingered like a wound? Then came the sound, faint at first, like the wind threading through bare branches. A whisper, some said. Others insisted it was children laughing. A farmer swore he heard a woman calling from the creek, her voice trembling with sorrow, repeating a name none could make out. They searched, their torches sweeping the trees, but found nothing. The noises grew louder, circling them until panic gripped the group. Some fled, while others fell to their knees in prayer. The prairie in that moment seemed to breathe with the grief of the vanished family, their absence alive in the very air. The climax of fear came not in sound, but in sight. A young boy among the group screamed, pointing toward the edge of the clearing. There, half concealed by mist, stood figures pale, indistinct, and motionless. The boy insisted he recognized the missing children, their eyes wide, their faces streaked with dirt, their hands reaching out as though begging for rescue. The adults saw only shadows, but shadows that seemed too solid, too deliberate, to be tricks of the light. Torches flickered, and in that wavering glow, the figures dissolved into the fog, leaving behind nothing but the rustle of grass. Word of the encounter spread quickly. By dawn, the story of apparitions at the cabin was on every tongue. Some believed the neighbors had witnessed the restless spirits of the family, doomed to wander the prairie until their fate was acknowledged. Others whispered of native warriors returning to taunt the settlers with illusions born of fear. A few dismissed it entirely, claiming hysteria had infected the minds of those present. Yet none could shake the chill of that night, the sense that the vanished family had returned, if only to remind the living of what had been taken. In the weeks that followed, the land itself seemed to rebel. Crops near the homestead withered faster than in surrounding fields. Hunters claimed that no deer or game would approach the area, as if the animals too sensed something unnatural. One man who attempted to settle on the abandoned property fell ill within days, racked with fever and delirium, muttering of voices calling from beneath the floorboards. He left before winter, refusing ever to return. The cabin, abandoned once more, stood as a monument to the climax of horror, its walls steeped in silence too deep to break. For the families of the valley, the climax was not merely about one night of terror, but the realization it crystallized, that the missing would never be found, not as the living had hoped. Their fate, whatever it was, would remain unknown, and the absence would continue to haunt the community. Mothers forbade their children from walking past the homestead. Men who once scoffed now carried charms or muttered prayers under their breath. Even the pastors grew cautious, tempering their sermons with warnings that some mysteries belonged only to God. And yet, amid the fear, fascination grew. Travelers came to see the haunted site, drawn by the story of the vanished family. They walked the path to the cabin, some brave enough to enter, others content to stare from the threshold. Many claimed to feel the same heaviness, the same unnatural stillness that had terrified the neighbors. A few swore they, too, had glimpsed figures in the mist. Each retelling grew more elaborate, more dramatic, until the climax became more than a moment in time. It became a legend, a permanent scar etched into Minnesota's history. This was the true climax, not a single event, but the point at which horror transcended fact and became folklore. The family that vanished was no longer only a tragedy of war, they had become a presence, haunting the imagination of everyone who lived in the shadow of the uprising. Their absence was louder than screams, their silence more powerful than any testimony. In a land torn apart by violence, where death was all too common, It was the unexplainable, the unresolved, that lingered longest. The prairie, vast and open, seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for an answer that would never come. And in that breathless silence, settlers understood something both terrifying and profound. Some stories do not end. They echo, shaping those who tell them, passing from generation to generation until history itself becomes inseparable from myth. The climax was not in the moment the family vanished, but in the realization that they would never truly leave. Their story had fused with the land, with the whispers of the wind, with the unease that crept into the hearts of those who dared to remember. The prairie would carry their absence forever, a shadow stretching across time, unbroken and unyielding. In the years after the Dakota War, the prairie healed in ways both visible and hidden. Grass grew over the scorched cabins, farms were rebuilt, and new families arrived to take the place of those who had been lost. Yet some absences could never be replaced, and among them was the family that had vanished without trace. Their names slipped from records, their graves, if they had them, were unmarked, and their belongings scattered or destroyed. But the silence they left behind did not fade. It deepened, stretching across generations, until their story became less about who they were and more about the void they left behind. Travelers passing through the region well into the 20th century spoke of the abandoned homestead, its ruins eventually reduced to little more than stones and faint depressions in the soil. Some swore that on certain nights, when the moon was low and the fog rolled in, shapes could be seen moving along the edge of the fields, figures too tall for children, too pale for men hardened by labor. The sound of laughter carried faintly through the grass, or the distant cry of a woman's voice pleading for help. These were not written into official histories, yet they endured in the whispered recollections of locals who refused to walk there after sundown. Historians, too, found themselves unsettled by the case. Most settlers who died in the uprising were accounted for, their names etched into memorials and church records. But this family remained elusive, their story recorded only in fragments of testimony and rumor. Some suggested they had been killed and buried quickly, their identities lost in the chaos of war. Others speculated they had been taken prisoner and perished far from the valley, their deaths never documented. A few entertained stranger ideas that they had fled into the wilderness, abandoning their past to survive in secret, or that the violence itself had consumed them in such a way that no evidence could remain. The absence became a symbol of the war's larger scars. The Dakota people, too, carried their own ghosts, ancestors hanged in public, families forced from their land, stories silenced by conquest. The vanished family was part of this broader silence, a reminder that war does not only destroy lives, it erases them. To speak of their disappearance is to speak of all the lives lost in confusion, all the names swallowed by violence and left unrecorded. The prairie, vast and indifferent, became their only tomb. As decades passed, the story entered folklore. Children in nearby towns were warned not to wander into the fields at night, lest they encounter the ghosts of the missing family. Campfire tales described the father still standing by the door of the cabin, axe in hand, waiting to defend his home against an enemy that never comes. Others imagined the mother calling endlessly for her children, her voice forever woven into the wind. These stories blurred the line between memory and invention, but they served a purpose. They kept the family from being forgotten. Even in distortion, their absence remained present. The mystery still lingers. Was their disappearance simply one more tragedy among many, lost to the chaos of 1862? Or does their story endure because it represents something deeper, the fragility of human life on a contested frontier? The ease with which history can erase those who fall between its lines. Perhaps the truth lies not in what happened to them, but in what their absence forces us to confront, that sometimes history itself is a ghost story, with gaps that cannot be filled and voices that can no longer speak. Standing on the land today, little remains of their presence. The grass bends in the wind, the sky stretches endlessly, and silence reigns. Yet for those who know the story, the silence is anything but empty. It is heavy, layered with echoes of screams, prayers, and the sudden stillness of a family erased. Visitors often describe a strange sensation as if being watched, as if the land remembers. Whether or not one believes in spirits, there is no denying the weight of history here, a history that refuses to release its hold. In the end, The family that vanished in the massacre reminds us of the most unsettling truth of all, that disappearance can be more haunting than death. A body can be buried, a grave can be marked, but an absence stretches endlessly, feeding on imagination, growing larger with every retelling. Their fate may never be known, their names may never be recovered, but their story endures, woven into the prairie, carried by the wind, and whispered across generations. They are gone, and yet they remain, forever caught in the twilight between memory and forgetting.